Hello, my name is Hannah and I'm a teacher at Twinkl. Thanks for joining me for daily reading. This is the third in a series of 5 videos where we've been reading a story called The Man Who Bought a Mountain. Each day we're reading a chapter of the story and then we're looking at a reading skill. I'm going to be asking you some questions, so if you'd like to write your answers down, you'll need a piece of paper or download the activity sheet in the link in the description below. You can type onto that activity sheet or you could print it out. If you've been reading along with me so far, I'd like you to pause the video now and think about or tell someone what you can remember about the story so far. Well done. In the story so far, we've met a boy called Yash. Yash lives on the Jagurdwa mountain, and it's his job to guide treks up to the base camp to meet his uncle Ranj, who takes them the rest of the way up the mountain. On his way home from a tour, Yash visited the sage and talked about the power of the mountain. The sage left Yash with an important message to think about and gave him a job to do on his way home. A few days later, Yash took another group up the mountain, and this included a very unpleasant man by the name of Theodore J. Goldlaw. This man has promised to buy the mountain, and Yash's father says that depending on the price offered, the farmers might be willing to accept. Today, while we're reading, we're going to be looking out for places where the author chooses words and phrases that help the reader to really understand what's happening in the story. Let's get reading. 3. When the Council of Elders called an urgent meeting the following week, Yash paid little attention, as he was far too busy with the goats which wandered over his grandfather's land near a little stream, and the chories on his mother's land. Of the two herds, he preferred the goats. Chories and yaks were a bit moody sometimes, probably because of all that boring dry land they grazed on lower down where the slope became a little flatter. At least the yaks had their long fur to make them look friendlier. The chories were all stretched skin on lumpy-looking bone, droopy mouths and heavy eyelids. When the villagers talked of being present for a second meeting, not long afterwards, however, Yash grew more suspicious. As he crept to the ramshackle village meeting hall and heard the shouts from the small crowd that spilled out of the doors, his mouth dropped open. "You can't sell the land! It's our mountain! It's sacred! Our ancestors have lived here and farmed on this land for generations," he yelled over the top of the raucous noise. "Yash, what are you doing here?" asked his uncle Ranj, shocked. "That man's an idiot! You mustn't allow it to be sold. He'll ruin it, whatever he does. The farmland is all around the slopes and foothills and the mountainside. We could lose it all." "Yash," interrupted his uncle, "the elders have met. They have consulted the sage. Mr. Goldlaw is offering a lot of money to buy the land which we all own. No one wants this, but it's too much money to be able to refuse. Maybe Mr. Goldlaw's plans will attract more tourists and we can focus on leading treks rather than farming. It could be good for us all." Yash stamped his foot. Why wouldn't anyone listen to him? There was something not right about that man, and he hated the thought of him owning the land on which all the community lived. What was he up to? Yash pushed his way into the building, under the arms and between the knees of the crowd. At the front of the room, the meeting was becoming rowdy. There were moans and grunts from many people who disagreed with the elders' vote. Yash spotted his mother and father stood close to the elders' table. His mother shot him a trademark glare as he emerged at the front of the crowd. Babakta, who sat at the table with other members of the council, held out a hand as if welcoming a good friend. "Mr. Goldlaw, please join us." Until this point, Yash had not spotted the sweaty, beetroot-faced man lurking at the side of the room. Theodore Goldlaw sidled over to the table. "With some understandable regret, a narrow majority decision has been arrived upon," Babakta said to him solemnly. "The Council of Elders has agreed that your offer will be accepted. We hope that it will be a profitable and constructive relationship for everyone." Grinning, Mr. Goldlaw held out a large hand. His cufflinks glinted briefly as he extended his arm towards Babakta. "However, there is one condition." Goldlaw hesitated. Babakta continued, "We are all guided eternally by the wise sage who lives on the mountainside. He wishes to meet with you before the deal is concluded. Other than that, we have an agreement." Babakta stood up and held out his hand to meet Goldlaw's. The portly man paused briefly, then grinned even more broadly. He gripped Babakta's hand and shook it with obvious force. Without letting go, he turned towards the disgruntled crowd as the piece of paper was passed along the table and signed in turn by each of the elders. Let's pause there to think about our reading skill for today. I'd like you to read the third paragraph on this page. Until this point, Yash had not spotted the sweaty, beetroot-faced man lurking at the side of the room. Theodore Goldlaw sidled over to the table. Sidled is an interesting word. Do you know what it means? Let's use the context and word families to work it out. The word sidled is obviously a way of moving, because Mr. Goldlaw sidles over to the table. Inside the word sidled, you might see the word side. We can guess that Mr. Goldlaw is moving sideways rather than walking forwards. Can you think of any reason why Mr. Goldlaw might be moving sideways to get to the table? Pause the video and write down what you think. Well done. I think that Mr. Goldlaw might be moving sideways because at the moment he is lurking at the side of the room. The room is small and crowded, so there might not be much space to walk normally in there. Or perhaps Mr. Goldlaw is moving sideways so that the crowd can see his face as he goes, because he obviously thinks he's very important. Either way, the author has chosen the word sidled to help the reader to see more of the picture. What if I change this word to something else? Mr. Goldlaw crawled over to the table. What does this do to your understanding of the story? To me, that would suggest that Mr. Goldlaw is not taking this seriously, and it doesn't really make sense in the context of the story, so I'm glad the author didn't use this word. Next, I'd like you to write down 3 other words that the author could have used instead of sidled. Here's the sentence: Theodore Goldlaw blank over to the table. Write down 3 options for this sentence and think about what each one does to your understanding of the story. Okay, let's keep reading. This is a great decision for your community and a sign of progress in our modern world. Thank you all for your patience, Goldlaw announced. The paper was passed finally to him, and he took his own gold pen from his inside pocket and leant on the table to sign with a flourish. Immediately he turned back to the crowd to finish his speech. Now that the deal is agreed and the land is mine, I am delighted to announce that I intend to move the Jagerdwa Mountain from its current position to a new, more accessible tourist location. Gasps rose from the crowd. People turned to look at one another in confusion. Unfortunately, Goldlaw continued, this will cause some inevitable disruption, and those of you living on the slopes of the mountain or the foothills will need to relocate. A cruel grin spread across his plump face. No one in the crowd seemed to know what to say for a moment. A few people laughed, uncertain if what they were hearing was serious. Move the mountain! You can't be serious. You can't move a mountain, shouted Yash. Babakta held up a hand. Yash, please. Mr. Goldlaw, there must be some misunderstanding. Could you explain what you mean? Just that, Goldlaw declared, as though he were suggesting nothing more unusual than pouring a cup of tea. I shall bring all the modern technology that the city has to offer, and the mountain will be moved to its new home. Relocate, came a shout from a farmer who lived near Yash's family. You mean you expect us to move? We can't just move. We've nowhere to go. We won't need to go anywhere, because you can't move a mountain, said Yash, almost laughing at the ridiculous nature of the situation in which he found himself. Several villagers nodded, and some raised their voices to agree with him. But Goldlaw puffed out his chest as Yash had seen him do before. I assure you, young man, that I can and I will. You will all need to be prepared to make way for my machines, and yes, those of you who live on the higher slopes will be required to move. As realization dawned on the villagers, fury and frustration grew. Most found Goldlaw's suggestion laughable, but all were concerned about the destruction that he would bring to their beloved mountain in his attempts to lift it off the ground. See, I told you not to sell it to him, Yash fumed, casting his eyes around at the stunned crowd. He pushed his way out of the tiny building, head bowed, and sat down on a rock. Plucking at the long, dry strands of grass growing loosely around its edge, he swallowed a lump which was forming in his throat. How could this be happening? It was only a few days later that great hordes of heavy construction equipment gradually began to arrive on the outskirts of the bamboo forest, where the flat valley ground began its long slope upwards. Mechanical monsters rumbled in, assembling like an automated army. It was the kind of equipment never before seen at the Jagurdwa. Enormous excavators, winches with reinforced steel cables, and huge hydraulic cranes with extending boom sections. Truck after truck rolled into the region, none of which looked remotely large enough to climb the Jagurdwa, let alone lift it. Rumours about Goldlaw's plans spread like wildfire. "They're going to try digging out the base of the mountain. They're blowing up bits of the mountain to loosen it." Just as quickly, worries and fears grew over the damage that would be caused. "How are the diggers going to get through the forest? Will they cut down the trees? What if the blast scares away the animals? What if it blocks up the river with debris?" Most villagers had refused to move off the mountain, none believing that Goldlaw would succeed in uprooting it from the earth. Uncle Ranj, however, was concerned. "If he's going to ruin the landscape with his awful trucks and dynamite," he said one morning, "who's going to want to climb the mountain then? I'll have no business, especially with Goldlaw taking a percentage of my profits. It's his land, after all." Yash stomped around in a bad mood. "This plan is crazy. We can't let it happen. This is our mountain, our home," he pleaded with anyone who would listen. "Babakta, what about everything you taught us? The spirit of the mountain, the connection to the gods, the life-giving land." Babakta looked forlornly at Yash. "The spirit of the mountain will always be strong. There is nothing we can do. The deal was signed." Yash did not understand Babakta. He definitely didn't understand Theodore J. Goldlaw when he arrived with the growing team of workers and vehicles. He wore a navy blue suit with a long grey coat buttoned over the top. His wide boots were the only attire remotely suited to the environment, those and the plastic white hard hat on his head. His bright blue tie was pinned to his white shirt with a sparkling silver clip. Yash couldn't recall ever seeing anyone in person wearing a tie before. A large space had already been flattened at the mouth of the bamboo forest where Goldlaw's men now stood, some hanging out of the cabs of their enormous vehicles. A small crowd of villagers had gathered. Mutters were passed around and anxious looks exchanged. Yash was among them, fuming more with every new machine's arrival. "Let's get this show on the road," Goldlaw declared, ignoring the crowd. The other men and women who had been with him in the trekking group filed along behind him, clinging to their screens and muttering into their earpieces. Yash couldn't help noticing that they looked a little nervous. Furtive glances were thrown between them every few seconds, and the group weren't the only ones acting strangely. Some of the men who were climbing into the vehicles seemed to be smirking slightly, and Yash even caught two of them rolling their eyes in Goldlaw's direction. That was when it hit Yash. None of Goldlaw's men and women actually believed that they could succeed in lifting the Jagurdwa. How could they? Each one was humouring their foolish employer, who thought himself more powerful than the ancient earth. Engines echoed like thunder as one by one they were started up. The hulking vehicles looked so out of place in the scene, overlooked by proud trees and with the crop fields stretching in front of them. The Chori herd, 2 fields over, stared at the noisy machinery invading their peace, looking more sullen than ever. A worker in a fluorescent yellow waistcoat stepped forwards. "Which way for the first crane, boss?" "Take it towards the northern face," shouted Goldlaw. "We can't get the trucks up through that forest, boss." "Don't worry," Goldlaw replied. "The bulldozers will make a path. We need the explosives team in first to loosen the rocks, and then the cranes can move in." The worker who had approached Goldlaw frowned, perplexed. "Right, boss. Of course. It's just that we don't think that it's going to be possible to—" Goldlaw bristled. "I am not paying you to think. I am paying you to do. I don't care how you do it. Just make it happen." His face was wobbling dangerously, and the worker blanched under his glare before lowering his head and hurrying away. "Ready the bulldozers!" shouted Goldlaw. A huge, hulking machine began to move. Yash's eyes filled with tears. Doing what is right is never easy, Yashaswin, but it is within your power. Suddenly, Yash thought of the sage. He hadn't met with Goldlaw yet. There was no way that the sage would allow this. Yash's last hope was with Guru Aluko. "No!" he screamed. running in front of one of the vehicles as it growled its way across the flat area of land towards the edge of the sloping Kaguno crop fields. That's the end of chapter 3. Before we go, I'd like you to have a look at the last paragraph. "No!" he screamed, running in front of one of the vehicles as it growled its way across the flat area of land towards the edge of the sloping Kaguno crop fields. What does the word growled do to this description of the vehicle? Does a vehicle usually growl? Why do you think the author has used the word growled instead of drove? Pause the video to write down what you think. Well done. Growling is usually something that animals do. The author has used this word to make the reader think that the vehicle is like a huge animal. Animals that growl seem dangerous, and it suggests that it's ready to attack the fields and forest and do damage. If the author had said drove or moved, it wouldn't have created this image in the reader's head, and we wouldn't understand the situation nearly as well. So, that's the end of chapter 3. There are more questions and activities that you can do after watching the video. Just click the link in the description below to download the activity sheet. Join me next time for chapter 4, where we'll be learning about something called fronted adverbials. See you then.